So good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us. Welcome to our online roundtable event, the Anthropocene in the Humanities and Social Sciences, an online roundtable on interdisciplinary perspectives. I'm Alexandra Metzi-Brodsky. I'm editor of the History of Ideas section at the Review of Democracy. And it's a great pleasure to have all of you here, both participants of this roundtable and our listeners who are following on YouTube. I also would like to introduce Robert Nemeth, who is the co-editing manager of RevDem and helping us with the logistics of the event, and kindly agreed to that. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with RevDem, it's an online journal of the CEU Democracy Institute, which is headquartered in Budapest, Hungary. We are dedicated to the reinvigoration, survival, and prosperity of democracies worldwide. It is a platform dedicated to fostering critical discussions on democracy, politics, history, and ideas. And we aim to bridge academic insights with public discourse. And today's event, of course, is also, I think, a testament to that mission. So just really 2 points on the rationale for the event. So the concept of the Anthropocene has increasingly permeated academic and public conversations. Now, institutes, research groups, or even research centers bear its name, reflecting its significance. And of course, also given our current situation, as the climate crisis intensifies, understanding the Anthropocene's impact on the humanities and social sciences becomes ever more crucial, I would say. So we wanted to organize this roundtable to provide a platform to reflect on these developments and explore interdisciplinary perspectives. So before we jump into the opening statements, just a couple of housekeeping notes. So we are discussing this here on Zoom, and the discussion is streamed live on YouTube. So the audience members can watch on YouTube and are encouraged to submit questions or comments in the chat section, and then we will address them during a short Q&A. For the speakers, as I mentioned when we are doing the opening statements, please keep your microphones muted so that we can minimize the background noise. We have a 1.5-hour session planned. So as I mentioned, first we will have the opening statements. Each of our 5 distinguished speakers will present up to 8 minutes. And then we have given the freedom for our speakers to set their own agenda, but of course it's going to be focused some topics around the Anthropocene. Then we are going to have a bit of a discussion and Q&A depending on the comments. So I think we can then start with the discussion. I just wanted to double check with Robbie that the streaming is okay and going online. Yes, great. Okay, so first, I would like to introduce Julia Thomas, professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, an influential voice in the fields of intellectual and environmental history. Her work explores political thought, historiography, and the concept of nature in modern Japan. Julia also published extensively on the Anthropocene. Her notable publications include Altered Earth, Getting the Anthropocene Right, and The Anthropocene, a Multidisciplinary Approach, which was co-authored with geologists Jan Zalasiewicz and Mark Williams. She's also currently working on a project that many of us are eager to read, titled The Historian's Task in the Anthropocene. So Julia, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say how grateful we are that you've arranged this and how important we all feel that this event is, not because we are important, of course, but because the Anthropocene represents such an unprecedented and unpredictable challenge to all our fields and, in fact, to everything that we value as human beings. So you asked us to talk a little bit about what the concept of the Anthropocene has done to us. I think maybe that's the best way of putting it. And for me, it's really definitively shaped and changed my research agenda and the way I work. I was trained as an intellectual historian of political ideas in Japan and became interested in concepts of nature and was edging into environmental history. And then wham, the concept of the Anthropocene emerged, and I began to realize that I needed to retool, that this wasn't like environmental history and engagement with ecology or environmental sciences. This was an engagement with the earth sciences, and in fact, two of them. As people here know, I suspect, the concept was originally enunciated by Paul Cruikshank within the context of Earth systems science, which is a relatively new science. It treats the Earth as a single integrated unit. And these measurements are quite different from the measurements in geology, which is the second science of the Anthropocene, which is interested, of course, in stratigraphy. And so I think I'm speaking for everybody here. It took a great deal of retooling to understand both these sciences and the way in which they are measuring the transformation of our planet, the abrupt rupture in the mid-20th century, in different ways, but in ways that are compatible. So the question for me became, if human systems have transformed the Earth system, as seems very likely, and indeed I'm entirely convinced of it, what is the role of historians in this? And I think that comes down to four things, depending on how you count them. The first one really is an engagement with the sciences, trying to understand exactly what they're saying. Not that I am a scientist, not that I can critique the science from the inside, but I can struggle to understand it and make friends with scientists. And I've come to collaborate with scientists, as you mentioned, writing with them, and that multidisciplinary effort seems really important. So understanding the science, but not trying to be a scientist, as you know, and critiquing them from within, since that's beyond my skill set. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the realization that this rupture in the continuity of the planet also indicates a rupture in the continuity of what it means to be human over time. So this means that there are going to be questions for the way we tell narratives. Narrative has implicitly relied on a kind of not just a biological continuity, as Dan Smale calls it, but also a planetary continuity, a kind of probabilistic evolution of planetary functions. And now we are suddenly in an unpredictable world. So there's a narrative rupture as well as an Earth system rupture. And that leads me to the third element in all this, which I think is a real challenge for us to think about. And that is the question of Earth system agency. We've always had modes of individual agency and social agency in local places and regional places. But what happened in the mid-20th century through globalization was the emergence of a transgenerational Earth system agency, which is beyond our categories of politics and ethics and control to imagine even, let alone address. And how to think about that is a real challenge. And then the fourth thing I would say, and I think some of your questions indicated that you were thinking along these lines too, is what the Anthropocene does to our notions of things like justice. Justice has developed has been a hope of generations of human beings and has developed on the idea that there was a way of making plans for the future. And if the world is truly unpredictable, then how do we go about doing that? And that's a real challenge, and also, I think, very frightening to think about. And so I'm going to end by just saying two things that I think funky old historians should do. We're probably not, all that interesting as scholars in this realm to many people, but I think we have an extraordinary role to play, and in two ways. One is to ask the question of how and why human systems came to overwhelm the Earth system. This is a question that scientists don't ask. It's not within their realm to explore that. And I think when we ask that question, we will find that there are many, many, many starting points to tell that story. It evolves in different places, in different ways, at different times. And those are extremely complex stories, leading to the realization that all of us now are in the Anthropocene. And how on earth did we get there? And so the second thing I think historians can do, and this is a rather hopeful thing, if I can venture to be hopeful in these grim times, is to look back and think about those societies that had very much shorter feedback loops for the things that they needed. And I think what's happened now is that we have built out global systems that are sometimes referred to as the technosphere or the anthrosphere. And they are, when they're working, they provide all sorts of things, but they are very fragile. And one of the things I think we need to start thinking about is how to disentangle ourselves from the technosphere. And one of the things history can show is how societies might build in redundancies and inefficiencies, which will drive our colleagues in economics crazy because they don't like those terms, and start to look at those societies that succeeded in those ways, not in creating perfect security or a utopian existence, but having more bows, more quiver, more arrows in their quiver when disaster came. So actually looking back in history to find redundancy and inefficiencies in short feedback loops. And so I'll end there again saying thank you.
Thank you. Very nicely timed. A great example. And that's super interesting, this final thought about the disentangling from the technosphere. And I'm a trained historian, so of course I was very much looking forward to what should be our role in relation to all these questions. But let us move on to our second speaker, Dr. Gregers Andersen, who is an external lecturer at the Department of Communication and Psychology at Aalborg University, Denmark. His research is broadly situated within the environmental humanities, as he examines how sustainable and unsustainable futures are envisioned in a range of communicative forms, stretching from future speculative worlds of literary and thematic fiction, called sci-fi, to the sustainable and unsustainable futures imagined and described by political parties or companies. He has, amongst other publications, authored the monograph Climate Fiction and Cultural Analysis, a New Perspective on Life in the Anthropocene. So, Gregers, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. So, in a book I'm currently working on titled Delusional Optimism, I explore the many forms of optimistic projections that is emanating out of the American tech industry. This includes projections from Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Ray Kurzweil, Mark Andreessen, and many other American CEOs and entrepreneurs, claiming that technological evolution will soon do away with many pertinent problems, including the global ecological crisis. The current motto of the American tech industry is, in the words of Silicon Valley Mark Andreessen, thus that, quote, "There is no material problem, whether created by nature or technology, that cannot be solved with more technology. End of quote. Put differently, Andresen and his colleagues are eager to ensure the global public that humanity is on the path towards an excellent future or a great Anthropocene. In this regard, particularly two projections reappear if one listens to the promises being spread by the American tech industry. One, that it is the destiny of humanity to break free of the physical limits that entropy sets for the human body in the form of death and become immortal, and that this will happen by merging ever more intensely with artificial intelligence. Two, that it is the destiny of humanity to break free of the physical limits that the planetary boundaries set for the development of the human species on Earth by colonizing space. The link between these two imperatives of transcendence is perhaps nowhere as spectacularly present as in the predictions made by Google's Director of Engineering, Ray Kurzweil. Indeed, compared to Kurzweil's predictions, Bezos and Musk's visions of colonizing the nearest parts of the solar system can almost be accused of lacking in ambition. According to Kurzweil, humanity should just strive for more than just to colonize the solar system. Or as he puts it in an interview from 2023, quote, "What I hope for is that we can spread our super intelligence throughout the universe. We can send out nanobots who can colonize other parts of the universe," end of quote. While he also predicts that, quote, "we will ultimately merge with our machines, live indefinitely, and be a billion times more intelligent, all within the next 3 decades," end of quote. But what does radically optimistic statements like these, have to do with how the concept of the Anthropocene is changing the humanities and the social sciences? Well, looking back on the last 15 years I've spent within the environmental humanities, it seems to me that there was a real moment some years back, just before the COVID outbreak, when concern about a coming climatic and ecological breakdown was not just fostering new trends in humanistic research, but also enabling researchers to connect with the public in new forms of activism. This was, so to speak, the moment of Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, and many open letters signed by researchers calling for political action in regards to the climate crisis. From my perspective, this moment seems now sadly to have passed. While the environmental humanities is still with larger curiosity exploring the relation between the human and the non-human, the media, at least in Denmark where I live, seem to have lost interest and moved on to new topics, with the war in Gaza and Ukraine the most obvious examples. This has left the playing field for technological optimistic discourses wide open. Where the Anthropocene concept has within the environmental humanities predominantly been translated as a call for transformative changes in most dimensions of human action, the techno-optimistic discourses are gaining public traction as a much less complicated and much more comfortable alternative. The narrative that technology will bring us ever more choice and freedom has simply proven to be too attractive compared to the narrative of major and urgent transformative changes being disseminated by most environmental humanities scholars. If the French researcher Etienne Auger is right when he states that, quote, "science fiction exists to invent and prevent the future," end of quote, it even seems fair to claim that we are within the environmental humanities being outfought and outplayed with our own means. It is thus noteworthy that many of the most optimistic entrepreneurs in the American tech industry allude to science fiction when they are asked to explain where the inspiration to their visions come from. In contrast to the dystopian imaginaries that the global ecological crisis typically prompts in speculative climate fiction, that entrepreneurs are thus merchants of what I called desperate science fiction. That is, to promote fairly new and ever more drastic technoscientific opportunities as the fundamental imaginary model for circumventing the risk of ecological collapse. And this with the obvious aim of downplaying the imperative of major social, political, economic, and cultural changes. Meanwhile, the desperation within the environmental humanities continue to grow, where the desperation of climate scientists for the American tech industry connotes new market opportunities. That is, a possibility to raise attention around new emerging, albeit risky forms of technology. There seems to be a general apprehension within the environmental humanities that it is now too late to avoid the hothouse Earth scenario that climate scientists has been warning about for decades. Yet one concept that SSH scholars could in this situation perhaps still mobilize around is that of sufficiency. defined by the UN Climate Panel as a set of measures and daily practices that avoid demand for energy, materials, land, and water while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. Sufficiency thus marks a route forward for both individuals and societies that radically opposes the idea that progress means rising consumption. In this sense, finding satisfaction in sufficiency will require something new of those of us who have grown up in the richest part of the world. As the expectation of perpetually widening consumption choices will have to go, we will have to find satisfaction in having much less stuff and in having completely different and very likely fewer consumption options and choices. This stands in stark contrast to the discourse that economic and technological fixes will fundamentally will make fundamental societal changes unnecessary. When the projections created and circulated by the American tech industry encourage us to imagine the future, it is thus very often futures that in most aspects mimic the present. That is, reproduce the same social and economic logics that has prompted disastrous climate change, ecosystemic breakdowns, rising economic equality, etc. in the first place. Of course, this may not surprise the cynic, who is, in the words of Fredrik Jameson, likely to insist that, quote, imaginary leaps into the future are little more than projections of our own social moment and historical situation, end of quote. But despite this undoubtedly has some truth to it, it is also too reductive a description as it ignores the power that imaginative leaps have in shaping expectations. In my view, it therefore makes more sense to acknowledge that imaginative leaps into speculative futures can influence political, social, and existential views, as well as stimulate emotion and desires, and that this includes the ability to inspire large-scale transformations, as well as the ability to help societies preempt risk and dangers. I therefore end this talk by suggesting that the task of generating and exploring new forms of sufficiency could offer a way forward for SSH scholars to fight the dominance of the optimistic discourses emanating out of the American tech industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important ideas and thoughts with some key topics, right? Imagination, the speculative fiction. I'm sure we will come back to this in the discussion as well. Let's move on to our third speaker, Stefan Garsman Jakobsen, who is director of the Center for Applied Ecological Thinking at the University of Copenhagen and associate professor in the Department of Cross-Culture and Regional Studies. His research is deeply engaged with eco-cultural transformation, climate justice, and the history of environmental movements, particularly in affluent societies. He is principal investigator of the Carlsberg-funded project, Climate Justice Temporalities, and co-PI of the Network for Global Justice and the Environmental Humanities, Transformative Engagements between Academia and Civil Society. Stefan, thank you for being here. Please deliver your opening remarks.
Thank you, Alexandra, for this nice introduction and for the invitation for this great event with great colleagues. So I really like the first two introductions, and I think what Julia told us about the changes to the academic approach is something I can really mirror. So I'm glad these remarks are out there. I want to highlight the relation between the debate on the Anthropocene in the humanities and social science and urgency, as well as the relation to concepts of urgency in the climate justice movement that I have studied before. This is maybe to gauge why I think that there's been very little connection made between early concepts of urgency in the Anthropocene and urgency for climate justice over the last 10, 20 years, what this might tell us. So the concepts of the Anthropocene that Julia introduced for us was put forward in the year 2000, I think, with a very, very strong sense of urgency. So that's also how we can understand the fact that it never became accepted among the broader scientific milieus, because it wasn't precise, but it was more of a desperate thing. But from Crutzen telling us that something else is going on and we might need to act in surprising ways. But I think something very different happened within the humanities and social sciences with this concept in the discussions. So where there was an understanding that this was a call for action in the beginning, but the first sort of epochal shock demanding urgent responses changed, and there was a lot of criticism against the sentiments, or well, actually against some of the ways of Earth system science to enter this whole field. As Fresot and Bonnoy, some historians from France, has told us, this was coming from people who would think very grandly about the Earth system, but also about interventions in these systems in terms of energy and land use change and so on. And so in broader humanities discourses, there was both an explicit and an implicit way of downplaying parts of this initial sense of the urgency, rather talking about what is actually the precision of the concept, what other scenes could we suggest, and many of these were not very, I didn't see as much as closely linked to a here and now urgency of mitigation before something, before some, maybe even not a tipping point, but windows for action, maybe apart from the discussions on the Capitalocene. So we have researchers who've looked into this, like Whelan and Lynch, who would, without suggesting a new scene, discuss some of the problems if you come from a very narrow singular spatial temporal narrative from the sciences and spreading that across different cultural contexts. But apart from that, we saw these wordplays on the Anthropocene, and this shifted, I think, the discussion from the origin of the Anthropocene discussions towards something that would look not so much at the short term but the longer term, and would be more about sensing our damaged planet, if not in advance, then at least imagining how that would happen. And some of these, you all know some of these concepts, but I think they had a spectrum from gaining a deeper understanding epistemologically of the crisis to maybe being even more ontologically oriented about changing our relationship with nature and other species. So we had some critical concepts that would focus on phenomena and processes like the Wastocene, maybe some more explanatory ones like the Pyrocene, and then more ontological and poetic explorations of the human environment interactions in the Cthulhucene. And some of the language that came out and at least affected a lot of the Scandinavian humanities discussions was this concept of living in ruins, recognizing potential insights of the futures we would have to acknowledge would come to fruition with ecological detriment. And I think this aligns in some ways with some of the research that, with some of the more globally oriented research investigating vulnerable, marginalized, and impoverished communities in the global south, where detriment had been a problem for a long time, and so the news was not so great. This was sort of molded in, if I can put it like that, in some of the Anthropocene debates to the global north perspective. And so it seemed that critical engagement with the concept itself have much more attraction than more hands-on approaches, or anything that would mean action in the long term, changed roles of different actors, whether that be scientists or students. And it was mainly left to a smaller group of Marxists like Andreas Malm, who would write more provocative titles on action, but also some smaller groups like the Scientist Rebellion. And I have a colleague, Fernando Rachimo, who has an upcoming book, Science and Resistance, the Scientist Rebellion for Climate Justice, which I think will tell some interesting stories about this. So I want to also talk a bit about some of the activist responses and see how they line up parallelly to this. And I think there was a similar transition from talking about the urgency of action while it would still be possible to stabilize, to have a chance at the 1.5 degree Paris target, for instance, to a very different approach. So now we have former leading figures in the European climate justice movement, as Tatsu Müller, who recently published a book on future outlooks that focus much more on vulnerabilities, resilience in the face of collapse, left-wing forms of prepping that reflect a shift from the short-term urgency of action, political action, to a longer-term acceptance of planetary damage, detriment, looking for new ways to act in this field. And this, I think, is echoed by more activists who accept overshoot realities, work systematically with grief, reorient their look on justice to be more a view of multi-species justice, working out new forms of utopia, drawing very much on the potentials of fiction that Gregers was talking about, but also using a lot of the material from the environmental humanities discussions. And so I think I'll just end up saying that there's a kind of synchronization between, because earlier on there wasn't this very much explicit overlap between the humanities discussions on the Anthropocene and activist climate justice sentiments, but there's a way of synchronization going on, which probably includes an ontological reorientation and ways of handling long-term futures in very, as Julia was talking about, with a lot of uncertainty. And I think this is not a very stable situation. I think we will see new waves of climate justice activism, maybe under names, that tries to find other ways of combining justice and urgency. So I want to propose that the times we live in now, even though they're synchronized between some scholarship and activism, it feels like a bit of an impasse, and I'm interested to hear what my colleagues think about this. And I might suspect there will be sort of a rupture with this humanities debates we've had so far. Once more details and once more emerge of from the Earth system sciences, but also once vulnerabilities become more clear to a lot of different groups. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, that was really great reflection on the reception of the term and its role, how also, I think, some of the keywords coming back, justice and action. So I'm also looking forward to if other speakers also see the synergies there. Well, we still have two speakers whom I need to introduce and then listen to their opening remarks. So let's move on. We have also Sabine Höller with us. Professor Sabine Höller is Chair of Science and Technology Studies at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. Trained in both physics and history of science and technology, Sabine's work explores how science constructs and communicates global environmental futures. She's particularly known for her research into metaphors such as spaceship Earth and the ways in which techno-scientific imaginaries have shaped sustainability discourses. Her book, Spaceship Earth, Envisioning Human Habitats in the Environmental Age, is a foundational study in the environmental humanities. Sabine, we're delighted to welcome you. Please go ahead with your remarks.
Well, thank you, Alexandra, for this generous invitation and this opportunity to speak here. And I can say that I can well relate to what the speakers so far have been brought up, especially Julia as a colleague in history. We're not trained Anthropocene historians, right? I identify as a historian of science, but I have this interdisciplinary background myself in the sciences and in STS and history of science and technology. And I would like to use the opportunity to speak a bit about how we here in Stockholm have worked towards becoming Anthropocene historians. We are, after all, or have been following the standards of our field. And we have turned more inter or multidisciplinary in the past decade, I would say, by developing fields like the environmental humanities, finding ourselves more and more undisciplined, you could say, while retaining a common core in history, and then also focusing on very contemporary questions and challenges of global environmental change, climate history, energy, resources, global governance, extractivism, industrial heritage. So in a way, looking at all these topics, you could say the Anthropocene was always looming on the horizon, but we had to take deliberate changes or establish deliberate shifts in how we research to become Anthropocene historians. And we have recently established a Center for Anthropocene History here at KTH in the last year. And I can report from how we did this that we try to leave the anthropocentric way that we think history has been written, as even the history of the earth sciences or the history of earthly spaces, earthly processes, we have always written in a way to understand how humans have made sense of those, how they brought them into existence, how they delineated those spaces, could be the atmosphere, the climate itself, the oceans, and so on, and shift that anthropocentric history to a anthropocenic history about how these earthly spaces also affect us. And that is a very different perspective. So the Anthropocenic denotes very vast temporal and spatial dimensions beyond our classic historical periods. So that is one challenge, I think, because these dimensions from the tiny, the molecular to the planetary, and from the deep past to the deep future, whatever that is, these scales we are not used to as historians to tackle, and they do, as we speak already, as I'm with Julia, they're already affecting us on so fundamentally human and non-human life on the planet. So how are we equipped to address this? And then secondly, we think that the Anthropocenic also redistributes agency, and that is also a challenge to the historians. Because what used to be peripheral, I think, in my perspective, even as a historian of science, like an ocean or a glacier, was rather peripheral to human history writing, that is now in the center of historical attention. So these earthly elements and environments appear as agential media. They have an agency that we need to address. So here is a paradox, I think, while many might think that the Anthropocene denotes this situation of human exceptionalism, because humans are the new geological force, I think they're actually not at all in control. And we have to now work through these inadvertent, unexpected, long-term consequences of human doing. And to return to my own workplace and my colleagues and our division of History of Science, Technology and Environment, the Anthropocene in some ways served as an umbrella for us, as an umbrella concept to summon what we've been doing already into a larger field that gives new meaning to what we've been doing all along. But I think that would be too simple to leave it with that, because we also think that Anthropocene history is really something programmatically, fundamentally new. It does challenge the traditional understandings of history fundamentally, and I have two modes in which I think we can do this. The one is the history of the Anthropocene. This is a very common way to put the problem and task ahead. And the other one is history in the Anthropocene, which I think is a different thing because it affects ourselves as historians and our role. So the Anthropocene as a historical object of study. Here, I think one challenge is that we're not just dealing with another historical period that we can just add to our inventories, right? So this new reality that we're dealing with is really including us, so we cannot distance ourselves in the same way that we might have as like observers before with historical periods that we've been studying. And then it's not easily delineated it's not a self-evident concept either that we can just take from the sciences. So here I would always be very careful. And yeah, you already mentioned it, other speakers mentioned it, the substantial and justified critique also of the Anthropocene concept. But we still need to do this work. We need to stay with the trouble, and I think the work will necessarily have to be anachronistic, and that is something that historians have a problem with. So this is really something we need to work through. One approach could be, an easy approach perhaps, is to ask how the concept itself emerged. That's a history of, for instance, the Anthropocene Working Group debates. One could address, that sounds simple, but it's actually a very complicated history of the struggle of the disciplines about the defining power over history itself, right? Who can write history? Who can tell us about what human or Earth history is? Another approach would be to write the social, political, or economic histories of the Great Acceleration. These rapid changes in human impacts on the Earth system since the 1950s, and we could ask how this Great Acceleration relates to the Great Transformation. Here, Karl Polanyi, 1944 book on the rise of the market economy. So this whole capitalist question of the Capitalocene emerging. Then there is the second important dimension on the history of the Anthropocene, that is history in the Anthropocene. And here I've, together with Andrea Westermann, followed three trajectories. One is scale, so dimensions of spatiality and temporality. I already mentioned the scenic. And the problem here is that we're not just dealing with, let's say, linear extensions of our common time periods, but we're dealing with, in lack of a better term, with foldings of time. Think of the vast past and futures that we fold into few centuries of industrial fossilism, for instance. So these foldings, perhaps what relates to Julia's unpredictability. So we cannot have a linear past, but not a linear future either that we can rely on, that perhaps is better than the one that the present that we have. The second trajectory was accumulation, and that referred to the history of materialities, of synthesization of materials, of disposal, of extraction, from waste to our bodies as dumping sites. So there's an unprecedented proliferation of materials, but also a disappearance, like extinction. And the third trajectory is accountability. So the question of who and how we hold accountable, and which, what is the position of the historian in this question of accountability? It's a self-conscious political position that we need to take. And those histories challenge our traditional understandings of the present, the future, and the past. And they expose us to inter and multi-species histories. They confront us with geohistory in a new way, that we need to align human history and Earth history. That really means we need to leave our comfort zones. And last but not least, we need to enter a self-reflexive mode of writing history in this new situation. And that addresses questions of justice that you asked about, Alexandra. We ourselves, of course, are in demand of conceptualizing our work, responsibilities of our own way of organizing ourselves. Now, how can we foster inclusive academic exchange, for instance? And then there's, of course, the question of the methods and approaches. How do we integrate human history and natural history beyond text? What would count as a source? What would count as an archive? So I think here we really see how the historical profession is challenged quite a bit. And I think that there is this huge ambition to make the humanities matter in a time where, in a way, people have come to the end of their resources. One question you asked was how the humanities and the sciences would relate. And I think that science is now marking time, maybe very literally, and it's now the time for the humanities to come to the fore and work towards these also possible and desirable futures. It's really existential that we do these things.
Thank you. That's a great ending to the opening statement. Thank you for sharing these thoughts. So before we are now going into the discussion, we have our fifth speaker. I'm very happy to have with us Zeb Trachtenberg, who is philosopher and professor at the University of Oklahoma, and he's also the founder of the interdisciplinary blog Inhabiting the Anthropocene. His work in environmental political theory focuses on developing a political conceptualization of human environmental transformation, drawing on the biological notion of niche construction. Zeb, it's a real pleasure to have you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra, and I echo my colleagues' thanks to you for organizing this. But I want to add another thanks, and perhaps Julia will join me in this, to my colleagues whose native language is not English and their willingness to speak in English. I certainly could not join in a conversation at all with you in your native language, and I so appreciate this opportunity. So coming last is both a kind of a privilege and a challenge here, but I think what I'll do, rather than addressing, except incidentally, the excellent points that have come up, I'll just say a couple of things that are in my mind, and I think in some ways they might be a little bit responsive to some of the thoughts that have come up. The first actually is quite responsive to something Julia said. She said that in encountering the Anthropocene idea, she had felt the need to retool, like this was some new thing that she had to learn anew how to deal with. I had actually quite the opposite experience. I mean, I was in a sense waiting for the Anthropocene idea even before I knew that it existed, and that points to something I think that I don't believe this idea has come up so far. There's a real sense, I think, in which the Anthropocene idea, if not the Anthropocene itself, but the idea is kind of a fulfillment of a very, very old trope, and that's I guess we can use the trope of second nature, which goes back to antiquity. The earliest version of it that I found is in Cicero, but I think it was sort of floating around and has been sort of continuous, straight through modernity. And the notion there, of course, is that the sort of given bifurcation between the human realm and the natural realm doesn't really hold up, and that our actual experience of the nature that we inhabit is one that we have very, very largely shaped ourselves. I'm using the second person plural there, and with all the conditions one has to put on that, but just for the sake of getting the conversation going. So I think this notion that the breakdown of a strict opposition between these two realms, that's an old idea. That's not a new idea. And so the Anthropocene becomes a kind of fulfillment of that, or a kind of poster child for that notion. So my own experience of learning about this new concept, and I can remember quite almost to the moment where I was when I first read about it in the 2011 proceedings or transactions of the Royal Society B. I think it was B or C. I remember thinking, oh yeah, well, that's what I've been thinking about or trying to think about for quite a long time, namely the notion that the human relationship with the natural world is essentially, not incidentally, but essentially a transformative one. And I think this is a theme that is found quite broadly if you look for it in a variety of traditional philosophers. I myself have been looking at that, and I came to that through a study of Rousseau, who remains a deeply important figure for me on this. But that inspired me to look at other canonical figures in my field, the field of political philosophy. So I find this in Locke, I find this in Smith, I find this in Hegel, is obvious. I mean, in many ways, things that Gregers was talking about, this sort of techno-optimism is sort of Hegel writ silicon, written in silicon. And I think the obvious figure here, who is, essential is Marx. So I think that the sort of patterns of thinking that we're falling into and talking about the Anthropocene are well established. Not the geology, not the earth system science, but the notion that there's a kind of breakdown of this divide is well established. So that's one point. I mentioned that 2011 issue of the Royal Society that sort of heralded the Anthropocene. It was about 10 years after the Crutzen expostulation, and this was really, in a way, the moment at which it became very public. There was an issue of The Economist that followed on that, and that really, I think, brought it into the public sphere. Turns out that same year there was another issue of the Transactions of the Royal Society, which to me was, in a way, even more influential, and that was where the notion of niche construction came into public view. And I don't want to go into the details of that unless it comes up in discussion. But niche construction is the idea that organisms, this is a primary feature of life on this view, that organisms, not just human beings, we all know about beavers or another kind of poster child, but really all kinds of organisms, including plants, modified their surroundings in order to make for the conditions of life. So what to me is really interesting about this is that is a mechanism that provides a kind of explanatory piece, which and someone made this point just now. I think it was Sabine, although at this point I can't remember who made this point. The earth system science and the geology do a obviously fabulous job of in a descriptive sense of telling us, okay, here are the conditions that we're facing, and here are some of the mechanisms which produced those conditions. But it's very much a descriptive enterprise as opposed to an explanatory one. And I think that what the biology brings, as opposed to the geology, is a more of an explanatory story about, okay, how did this happen, or why did this happen? And we can tell the story, obviously, of the Capitalocene story of the particular power relations that led to the conditions that we now observe. But I think there's a more fundamental story, a biological story about, I can say, the nature of life that we have to bring into consideration. And I'll end then with a remark about, well, is there uptake on within the humanities and social science of the niche construction idea? I think, in fact, it's probably more in social science than in the humanities. So when I just sort of browse around, I find articles coming out of anthropology, I find articles coming out of sociology that really embrace the niche construction idea, the human niche construction idea, and some that really see the Anthropocene as a geological or earth system phenomenon as a kind of niche construction, or the manifestation of niche construction writ large. So with that, I'll say thank you again to everyone who started, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, fantastic. And I think basically you already started. What we would like to do and continue is I will open now the floor for discussion. So first, maybe I would ask if you also maybe have any, you want to respond or ask, or there was anything that came to your mind as you were listening to your other colleagues. Julia? And then Stefan.
Well, thanks to you all. I mean, it's just a wonderful beginning. Zev, it's super to see you again. I think it's been some time. And I am very interested in this notion of niche construction and the recognition that all organisms change their environments. That seems to me essential. And one of the reasons I like looking at biology rather than some of the more mathematical sciences is that it gives us so many contingencies and is aware of the idea that different things can happen in the course of niche construction. So what I enjoy you're talking a little bit more about is the problem I think we face in political theory and also in history of putting together the sciences with the humanities and social sciences, and in relationship, I'll just say, to determinism. And there is, of course, a way of telling the Anthropocene story, which says we have always been destined to get here. This is simply what every species does that can do it, is over extract from their environment, change things too much. And I'd love to hear you talk about that, how you think about that problem.
The problem of determinism versus.
Yes, in relationship to the niche construction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I think I had a very sobering conversation with, as it happens, with John Odling-Smee, who's one of the founders of the niche construction approach, in which I was chided profoundly and embarrassingly for not understanding differential equations sufficiently to understand the model that he was working with. So I think the notion that, I mean, obviously this is an issue within biology. To what extent can, is mathematics a tool or sort of a, kind of unpleasant dominatrix who is trying to force biological thinking into too rigid a way of going. But I think it's the difference between biology and the earth sciences is not that it's not quantifiable or modelable, but that the degree of complexity is just so great that it strains the capacity to model in any way that's very simple. And the poster child there, the Volterra equations for predator-prey relations, which seem very elegant and, conceptually attractive and just don't work. Yeah, I mean, they work in, if you in a lab where you have two species and can really control things, but in the wild, so to speak, they just don't work. That's not because the math doesn't work. It's because the number of factors involved are so great. So I think complexity is really the issue. And the Earth system scientists are very down with that notion because they're all about the kind of unexpected results that happen in very complex interrelationships within systems. So that, I think, is one way of getting at the question of determinism. So if I mean, one of the things that people who, or that I'm thinking here of the notion of environmental determinism, which is an old notion that the way, political formations are the product of climatic facts or something like that. But I think the degree of complexity that life has, and then you layer on the kind of Earth system phenomena, just makes that sort of deterministic thinking, even if at some metaphysical level you'd say, yeah, there's the principle of sufficient reason, as we like to talk about, where nothing happens without a cause. So there's determinism in the world. But our epistemic capacities may just make it impossible for us to meaningfully make predictions on the basis of, any kind of natural science sort of fact. I'm sorry if that became a little wandry there, but does that address what you were asking?
It's just great to hear you talk about this stuff. I think that's right, especially the emphasis on complexity. And one of the dangers of the things that Gregors was talking about with our tech friends, the tech bros, is that they think they can create and master a second nature and completely control it. And I think, Gregors, you would say that's a little unlikely.
Great. Stefan, I think you also wanted to speak.
I can let Gregors answer directly, so keep the flow going.
Then first, Gregors.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Yes, certainly. I don't think that it is very likely that they'll be able to achieve what they say they'll be able to achieve. So I think that there are some sort of major risks involved in the power that the tech bros currently have. They are setting direction. They are sort of promoting this idea that, you know, a human civilization, human development has always been sort of one sort of linear progression forward. And I think now where I come from, where I've sort of over the course of the last 15 years read a lot of sort of dystopian climate fiction depicting very dystopian futures. I think there is certainly a clash between what sort of also the mood that I sort of experience within the environmental humanities, where I think there's very much the experience that at some point this idea of an uh, Earth system that is sort of driven by perpetual economic growth, that it at some point will come to some kind of maybe not a collapse, but at least sort of face some kind of limits that will sort of what do you say generate some very nasty situations. And of course, maybe we're already seeing that with a lot of people who are sort of suffering in the global south. That was also the perspective that Stephen was talking about with the climate justice, that we are in fact already now seeing, you know, victims from this ideology that there is only one way forward, and that's through perpetual economic growth and technological development. There is sort of victims that are sort of made by that narrative and that ideology now. So it's also for me a question about what time frame are we talking about here? When are we ready to step into that sort of exponential future where everything will be amazing, right? Because meanwhile there are people who are suffering and being from climate disasters in the global south, and I think we cannot really ethically justify that when there are the possibility of sufficiency and other kinds of thinking restraint. Yeah.
Alexandra, I think you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. So just wanted to check, you want to comment on this or a different topic?
Yeah, sure. I guess I just maybe not being very precisely following on the determinism debate, but it just reminded me of, you know, and it going back to some of the points that Julia made in the beginning of what we're dealing with, or what. So one thing are the complexities of explaining these different systems in the Earth system sciences, and another thing is the kinds of perspectives they are sometimes talking about. So let's say, for instance, uh, the search of studies on the risk of tipping points, of climatic tipping points and other ecological tipping points, and as one example, but actually also, you know, maybe following on what Gregers was saying, a lot of other versions that would be available of tipping points intermixing more strongly with social systems, where, you know, certain constellations have maybe face very large risks. And so I think, how do we factor that in? And maybe another is something that I would like to hear others speak about, and which is, I think, is part of the urgency equation for me, that I think we, as in the humanities, should also have an understanding of. And I think one way of connecting it very strongly is that this is in competition, I think, with many of the high level discussions we have with a very strong economic paradigm that both Julia mentioned, and Gagas in a way also by talking about sufficiency is challenging, which is just still unchanged. It hasn't at all integrated the risk of irreversible change, the urgency of the time frames of tipping points and so on. And so that is to me something that is very, where I think the humanities and social sciences could also play a role in untangling this and just making it more clear that we really have competing approaches, and we seem to side with the earth system sciences and biologists, but it doesn't become, it still doesn't register like that, you know, in the science policy framework. And I think something to help with.
That?
I'm sorry to take the conversation back a step because what Stefan just said is so important. That's a risk and this kind of thing. I had a question for Gregors, which is, do those guys really mean it? I mean, when I hear a lot of those pronouncements, I think that's just, can I say a bad word here on YouTube? That's just bullshit. I mean, it's bullshit in the formal sense, which is it's statements that are made without any regard for being truthful, you know? So I just feel like when I hear that kind of stuff, I just say, yeah, that's advertising. That's not a serious kind of claim. So what do you, I mean, you're more engaged in that. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. That is advertising, that is marketing. Because when they sort of speak about these magical abilities of technology, they're basically also marketing their own firms and the products that are selling. So definitely. But to a certain extent, I maybe I'm a bit naive, but maybe I also think that there's also a history, right? There is sort of a long history for these kinds of imaginaries, sort of very techno-optimistic visionings about the future. And I think it has already been always been a very sort of strong part of libertarianism in the US. So I think there is a history there that goes some decades back at least. So to a certain extent, I think they've been also the point that they've been molded by sort of science fiction. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, they are always talking about how they've sort of been so extremely inspired by science fiction, and especially science fiction that was basically made in a sort of in the 50s and 60s, which was really optimistic. And to a certain extent, I think they're still in their sort of room at home, watching these sort of very optimistic sci-fi stories and narratives. And I think to a certain extent they've sort of just stuck with that. So that would be another way of explaining it. But yes, definitely marketing.
Julian?
Just to pick up on this thread, I was in Stanford in November, and oh yeah, they believe this completely. And I was talking to a historian of science, and he was talking about how we can have infinite energy and it can be great, it'll be marvelous. And I said, well, what about losses in biodiversity? And he sort of shrugged and he said, that would be sad. And that was it. And I wanted to mention, because I'm sure Gregors knows about this, wonderful new book by Alison Carruth, who is pairing this techno-utopian vision with new forms of science fiction of the kind that Gregors was mentioning. And she makes an incredible plea for these competing imaginations and what it is that people like those people on, like us on this Zoom, the kinds of imagination through which we counter the techno-optimist imagination, which is actually a delusion, and as Zev said in very strong terms, is like crazy. And I think what's so interesting there, and Gregors knows this material so much better than I do, is that our more alert science fiction readers are the ones who are pointing out their failed imagination. And we're both in the world of fiction here, but one of them is a much more realistic fiction, and that's the one we call science fiction. And the one we call technology, it turns out, is the wrong fiction, the more delusional fiction.
Right, Sabine?
Yes, thanks. So when I heard Gregors speaking, I felt very much reminded of the techno-optimism of the Cold War space and arms race, and the same, in a way, exit strategies to colonize space when exponential futures on Earth seemed rather, exponential growth, and then, in a way, exponential collapse that was at the horizon. What I find is so curious is that we see how, what Julia said, ruptures in time, ruptures in the continuities that we were used to in this Holocene period, in a way. How we do not have any instruments, it seems, to handle the non-linear, whether it's tipping points or other ways of passing thresholds with open ends that we don't have an idea how to handle. And I don't need to believe all of Earth system science to understand that something is in motion that is almost roller coaster like. And you could say the tech bros manage this kind of discourse perfectly, just sitting in this roller coaster and taking it to new extremes. But for many, this kind of exponentiality, it will of course be just detrimental. But I wanted to put that in connection to what's currently going on, that is very much about like linearity, like the carbon capitalism that is one solution, or people see it as a solution of working with the future to make up for the depths of the past. And here we don't even think about exponential futures or thresholds or tipping points, but we think that we can have a net zero sum. And that, I think, betrays futures for many, or perhaps for everyone on the planet, that we think can be sustainable and actually change the possibilities and the conditions for anything that is sustainable over a longer run, because we're in a way playing with these temporal modes. And that, I find, is at least as problematic as working towards a exponential better life that is somewhere out there in this golden age on Mars. But we also see it with geoengineering technologies that are already being developed, or like you say, carbon capture technologies, where we see how time is being used as an approach to balance out. So also a promise, with the promise that there is a future where we can make up for what is already going totally wrong. And I think that's also in a way a false promise, because it does rely on an idea that we can basically continue in the same condition in a near future that we have now or had in the recent past. So I don't know how you see onto these, like the things that are currently in the making, in like offsetting this whole myth of to offset, right? That we can offset always, like we substitute.
Julia? Can't hear you.
I think Stefan's hand was up before mine.
Oh, okay.
I have a
Apologies.
question for Stefan, but let him go first.
So first, Stefan, and then you will get the question as well.
Okay. Thanks. No, it's just wanted to follow up on the point just made by Sabine. I think you could listening to you, I think we're used to thinking about this model of the Overton window to create more acceptance of climate action. But I think it works the other way as well. So there's an Overton window being opened up by the examples that Gregers explained to us, and what is being moved in and seen as very normal is what Sabine was talking about. You know, relatively complex climate economical models that churn out results that we're then supposed to accept, that you know, we don't get a proper discussion of offsetting of negative emissions, of what it really means in any sort of real political sense, maybe especially for poorer countries. And so I mean, that we should really be aware that mechanism, of course, also functions far away from any progressive sense, right?
Julia? And then Zev.
Alexandra, am I
Yes.
allowed to speak now? So I have a question for Stefan and also I think for Zev, which is about justice, which you raised as crucial to this particular Zoom. And one of the things I've been wondering about is that the old idea of justice was in many ways retrospective. When things happened, you corrected them, or you created a system where they could be corrected. And it seems to me, as we face the kinds of coming disasters where work is being done showing that we're going to have huge numbers of people migrating in the future in areas without sufficient water, and that we need to pivot somehow from retrospective justice to new forms of kind of prospective justice, where we're actually trying to organize societies to respond to coming collapses and areas of danger. And of course, most of the worst of these will be in the global south. And I'm not really asking whether this is politically possible, given what's going on in the United States right now. It's hard to believe in any political possibility. But just in theoretical terms, does that switch towards prospective justice make any sense for those who have thought a lot about this?
So this was a question to Zev and Stefan. Maybe first Zev and then Stefan.
I have some views on this as it happens, but I wanted to get in the queue for another question, which is actually goes in a different direction. So perhaps I can say something, and maybe after Stefan speaks, I would love to have the chance to ask another question. Yeah, I think there is a way of thinking about that, and I think the concerns of distributive as the justice is sort of categorized, classically, or going back to Aristotle, one of the sort of divisions of justice. I mean, there's sort of retributive or restorative justice, which is backward looking, to address past wrong. The notion of distributive justice, I think, is sort of neutral, temporally speaking. So it's not just, somebody took from you in the past, and so we need to, give back to you to kind of even out the distribution. But it's there's a sense, and this is, to bring out the big name. This is what Rawls is talking about in theory of justice, is organizing a society so that the ongoing processes of distribution are fair. And I think, to be honest, that's sort of my kind of on my research agenda, long delayed, I fear, but on my agenda is to think about how this notion of niche construction, which is about, the way I frame it, is about the sort of the political management of, or it inspires an idea of the political management of what I would refer to as habitability, or the resources for good habitation, not just in the organic or metabolic sense, but also in the kind of more meaning-laden cultural sense, is about setting up good infrastructure. And good infrastructure is infrastructure which distributes the costs and benefits of social cooperation in a fair way. So I think that is forward-looking. So far, infrastructure, the crisis of the Anthropocene that people have referred to in moving out of somewhat relatively stable Holocene conditions is that it's easier to design infrastructure when you have some sense of the boundaries of, how much rain is likely to fall. And so in a condition where we don't really know that, it becomes a more severe engineering problem about how to design infrastructure that is not going to flood the poor neighborhood, down the at the bottom of the hill. But conceptually, that's hard, but it's not impossible. And so I think that the notion of just the civil engineering project of building stuff that's going to provide for the needs that human beings have, and not just not just the metabolic needs, but the cultural needs. Building stuff, creating the infrastructure of a society that's going to provide for that is a way of looking forward. And I think many people in architecture and civil engineering and in other domains that actually build stuff are indeed thinking about that. I think that's an active project.
Stefan?
Yeah, I can maybe I'll try and be brief because I'm sure that there's a lot going on in contemporary political philosophy on addressing some of these things. I mean, there's a lot of thinking about future generations, but there's also a lot of combining this with the rights of nature. So speaking to self habitats and intermixing that with human societies. And I think also what it goes back a bit to what I mentioned briefly in my introductory comments, that we see from some of the activists, at least in the local sort of global north Scandinavian context, there's a pivot to being very explicit about what do we imagine this future should be like. I mean, what are some of the stuff that we need to have out there to dream about? And I think then the big problem is that for some communities, there's just so much loss going on that some of the stuff you would like to have a place for in the future it's becoming more and more unlikely. So it really goes hand in hand with grief, a lot of these issues, and yet it's still being worked actively on.
Right, and I give the floor back then to Zaf to ask your question. And also maybe just to mention, so we are soon approaching, unfortunately, the end of this discussion, which is crazy. It feels like we have just started. So I also wanted to tell you that if you have any closing remarks, you can chip in afterwards. But first, Zaf, and your question.
So my question is this, and this is provocative and might be a good way, maybe it's a good way to end. But just as I suggested that the Anthropocene was highly anticipated conceptually by, a sort of long-standing effort to dissolve the nature-culture divide. There's another sense in which the Anthropocene is anticipated as well, and that's as a version of apocalypse, a kind of secular apocalypse. And so I can't remember the name of the French author who wrote about this, making this point, and others have made it as well, that I'm going to be obnoxious in the way I put this, but the sort of gloom and doom that goes along with a lot of Anthropocene discourse, that's not unfamiliar. I mean, there are patterns in human thought that's canalized. I mean, there's a channel for that kind of apocalyptic thinking. Now, the reason that's obnoxious is I absolutely don't want to associate myself with a sort of dismissive attitude towards genuine suffering, but the notion that, oh my God, this is the end of civilization, maybe that's true. I think the alternative to that is not the techno-bro idiotic optimism, which may not even be sincere, but there's a kind of, perhaps a middle ground there, the kind of muddling through prospect, which I don't think ought to be dismissed, really. And again, I think that one of the things that the niche construction perspective offers is the recognition that, human beings and other species as well, but human beings are particularly ingenious in addressing challenges. And so that prospect that maybe apocalypse can be avoided, I think at least ought not to be dismissed. So I just put that out as a discussion point.
Great. Always great to end with the apocalypse, the discussion. Any thoughts on that, or in general, reflecting on the Anthropocene as a concept, as others have been also reflecting on it, whether it's also like a bridge to other things or maybe not. Julia?
Oh, well, again, Alexandra, my thanks as we close out this very interesting discussion. One of the people that I think is really interesting to think with at this moment is Hannah Arendt. And several people are now doing this, partly because she saw that technological drive to eliminate unpredictability in our lives as something that had gone along for a long time. Human life is difficult. How do you make sure you're going to have a good supply of food and heat and all those things? And she points out in the human condition that we have now taken unpredictability out of the human sphere and projected it on the planetary sphere. And it's a really interesting way of thinking where we have ended up, because it's another way of talking about tipping points and what we do about tipping points. And I think that's why it's so very interesting to think about reabsorbing, and this is a sort of dangerous thought, reabsorbing unpredictability back into our lives. And of course, this is easier to imagine for those of us who are already living lives of abundance and don't mind giving up a little bit of these instant meals that arrive at our doorstep and all this sort of stuff. But it suggests that as we look more towards the local, more towards shorter feedback loops, where we're going to face moments of unpredictability and not being able to get things that we want and not knowing things we may want to know even, that in this more tentative world, we need to look to one another more immediately. And I had a very brilliant student who came to me and said, Professor Thomas, I think me and my friends think we have about 10 more good years. And then we think we're going to go over the tipping points. And this is Zev's doom and gloom. And I said, you know, you're going to do okay, because not only was she going off to train as a medical doctor and could also learn how to do medicine without big machines and equipment, but she had a lot of friends. And I think that those skills of creating community are ones that we've lost a good bit of, and we need to reestablish those. And I think that is one of the things that history can do. We have organized ourselves in different ways as human beings, and a more precarious community where there's a lot more reliance on one another is certainly the way most people used to live. It doesn't seem to me a bad idea to recuperate some of that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Julia. Gregors?
Yeah, so it's just also a response to Seth, that at least to me, I think it's extremely important also that we as sort of researchers and scientists, we also engage publicly, because I think, you know, if we want that sort of middle ground that Seth is talking about, that will only come if we sort of critique the power structures of the contemporary world. That's why that's at least my project with sort of calling the bullshit of the tech growth. It's basically also to sort of to make that critique public, because I think it's so important that we connect our research to yeah, what goes on in sort of the public arena and sort of parliamentary politics as well. Just to give an example, right, you know, because it's not only today it's the tech bros, but for example, there was also the example of William Nordhaus, who in the 1970s was sort of making this 2 degrees sort of threshold for global warming. And today, now in his Nobel sort of laureate speech in 2018, he's sort of talking about that this is the optimal point for economic growth is at, you know, 3.5 degrees. So it's also about sort of criticizing to me in public, and also in sort of participating in public debates as scientists, criticizing all these notions that are sort of so to speak, taking the world in the wrong direction. And I think there are sort of also it's also to me about perhaps being a little more brave and having a little more courage for us as scientists to engage in sort of public discussions and debates.
Thank you. Are there any? Yeah, Sabine?
Yeah, thanks for these encouraging, some of these encouraging ideas. I'm totally not a doom and gloom person. I'm not easily caught by any kind of alarmism. So I think this idea of muddling through in many ways and through perhaps hundreds and thousands of different tipping points that we will see, because that's much more likely than having a planetary boundaries tipping point that will affect everyone in the same way. No, we won't have that. But this muddling through brought me to this idea that we need to work not against, but with our environment. And one idea that we at our center are now nursing is to work on Anthropocene infrastructures. And they're not the classical technological critical infrastructures, but conceived in a way that is from the start both natural and technical, and it can also be corrupted, it can be exposed, it can be contaminated, but it will still work, like microbial infrastructures, for instance. So even the contaminated or polluted can make a contribution. So we're planning for a workshop in the fall on this topic with Danish colleagues, actually. Perhaps someone of you in the room will be part of this. I'm not sure, with the Aarhus colleagues. So I think there are ways to think in local, smaller terms about different conceptualizations that we can try and test. So there is always also an optimism, I think, in this Anthropocene situation that we can nurse and cater to.
Thank you. So our time is up, but I do want to ask just Zabit and Stefan if you want to say anything, so that you were also given the chance. Just let me know now. 1, 2, 3. Stefan?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you very much for a very stimulating discussion.
And I echo that 100%.
Thank you. Then I'm also just left with the task to thank all of our panelists. It's been really great to have you here. It's been, I knew it will be great, but it was even better. I'm sure it's also very intense, lots of ideas. But I think thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And we were really happy to host this event on RevDem. And yeah, our discussion ends today, but I'm sure discussions about the Anthropocene, we have heard about the complexities and the multifaceted approaches that we have in humanities and social sciences. So that discussion is going to continue, maybe at some other future RevDem events, and I'm sure in the research of our panelists. So thank you again to you, and also thank you for our listeners. So goodbye.